everyone. Today I wanted to take a look at sharpening on whetstones. Unlike some of the other videos, I'll be talking both about synthetic and natural whetstones. Most of what we're going to talk about is relative to either or, but I will take a little bit of time to talk about some items regarding just synthetic stones. This will be a more beginner-oriented video. If you're someone who's really familiar with whetstones already, you can go ahead and probably skip this video. And if you are just starting out, I also advise that you take a look at other videos that are out there. You know, I'll cover things from my perspective, what works for me, but it's always good to get additional perspectives so that you can figure out what works for you. Everybody's technique, while it follows maybe certain core tenets, will be a little bit different person to person, and I do think it's good to be exposed to different methods or philosophies or things like that. But the goal for today will just be to talk about some information regarding synthetic stones, how to maybe prep the stones a little bit before use, a little bit of the terminologies you might need to know, and then how we would actually work the blade on the stone from a beginner's perspective to get a successful edge when we're using our kitchen knives. So the first thing I'll cover is the whetstones themselves and the bases you put them in. So when you buy a whetstone, you could just buy the stone like this, by itself out of a box. Most people are going to start with a synthetic stone, and unless if you're really interested in natural stones and diving into all the preliminary research you need to do to get the right one, a synthetic stone might make the most sense for you. But I do think there are some things to consider when you're thinking about taking that first step. The first is that usually you're going to want some form of stand for your synthetic stone. Some people will put down a towel or something and put the stone there. It can lead to an uneven surface. It is usable if you really want. Sometimes stones come with these little plastic holders that'll have rubber feet. These are okay. You know, they do a good job of holding the stone, but I do find that as you're using, the stone can still wiggle around. My preferred stone holder are most definitely these rubber ones you can get. This is made by a company called ITO, but there are many that are similar. You know, they have this movable middle part, they have screws to adjust, and you can, you know, really get the stone secured in it. But when you're talking about starting off with whetstones, where maybe your budget is $50 and below, blowing 20 of that budget on just the stone holder might not be the wisest decision. So maybe going with one of these integrated just in the beginning when you're learning makes the most sense. There are a lot of whetstones out there for the beginner. I do recommend though that you steer into a direction where your stones will be more usable for a longer period of time. That means basically two different things in my opinion. Again, my opinion can be different from other people's. The first is that I tend to recommend for beginners a company called King. They are very well known within the whetstone world. They made some of the kind of like groundbreaking first whetstones when they were just being released to the market. And they still make whetstones that, for the price, hold up to the competition. There are obviously nicer whetstones, there are more expensive whetstones out there, but for a beginner, I think the King brand is still really top of the list as a starter brand. The one thing I will suggest, though, is to avoid these combo stones. This is a King combo stone, but even then, I would recommend avoiding all combo stones. There are a couple reasons for this. The first reason is that frequently the 1000 grit or lower grit stone you're going to get will have different water and soaking requirements than the finer grit stone that is attached to it. So in this case, this 1000 grit stone is a stone that wants to soak for probably 5 minutes. This stone on the back, when you buy it by itself, they recommend you don't soak it at all because it could crack. So you kind of get this split personality situation going on. Of course, you could soak it in a pool of water that's only as tall as the 1000 grit, which is the intention, but I do find that to be extremely tedious. On top of that tedium, though, this plastic base plus combo stone combination is probably like $30. You can get a full-sized version of this 1000 grit, which is going to be about that thick on its own. You can get a full-size version of this 6000 grit, which will be about that thick on its own. And one of them will probably come with this type of a base, cumulatively for maybe 40 or 45 bucks. So a little bit more, avoids that weird split brain personality situation. You get stones that will be much more stone for your money, easier to use in that case. And sometimes with these combo stones, when you're using, of course, the coarser side first, you're going to have grit, which can run down into this area, and you'll have to, again, pay special mind to ensure it doesn't pollute your finer grit stone as you flip it over and clean it off. None of that is things you can't overcome, of course. However, given the money difference and that the other stones that are full-size ones will last you far longer, I really don't recommend these combo stones for people. I know they're attractive for beginners to save that little bit of extra money, but even if you don't like doing this and you end up reselling your stones, those whole stones will be resellable far easier than these combo stones will be. So I think people should take a look down that route. Spend the extra 10 bucks, and it gives you, I think, benefits well worth it, in addition to more literal stone. It's hard not to want to go that route, in my opinion. So some other things you might run into is usually when you're dealing with these stones, especially the coarser ones, they might be what's called self-slurrying. Slurry is what we refer to as the mud on the top of the whetstone that provides lubrication as we run the knife over its surface. As well, it can increase the grinding power of the stone a little bit, depending on how thick the mud is and how much water you put on there. Usually, maybe not usually, frequently you'll see stones sold with these little companion stones. They are going to either be called a slurry stone, a rubbing stone, a correcting stone, or a Nagura. Nagura is the traditional term for it, and I think when you buy kingstones, if they're included, they will be called a Nagura, but all of those are synonyms for the same purpose. The stone is used primarily to either, well, I guess for a few different things, to either generate mud on the top of the stone, especially when it's not a self-slurrying stone. For instance, this 6000 grit will not really self-slurry, so we would use this to generate the mud to begin our process and speed things up. On our 6000 grit side that is self-slurrying, we would still use this though, because you are not going to naturally work your blade on every single part of the stone evenly. So over time, you're going to get high spots and you're going to get low spots, and you will use this Nagura to even out the stone over time. Third, you can use this to take care of your sharp corners as you work the stone down. Is a Nagura necessary? It depends on the stone. If you're using these softer stones that self-slurry only, which again, a lot of higher quality synthetic stones will self-slurry, even at higher grits. Some natural stones will self-slurry. This one would, this side will, that side won't. In those cases, maybe you don't need a Nagura. You will still need, though, something that can flatten the stone out over time, because you will wear it down. Some people will use a tile with abrasive powder on it. Some people will go outside to concrete in the front of their house and flatten the stone. I don't personally like that method, but I know a lot of people will do. Generally speaking, though, I think the Naguras are cheap and worth having because they give you just some additional utility. My actual preferred Nagura is what's called a diamond plate, or a diamond Nagura. They look like this. You can get them for cheaper without the handle. And they are a flat aluminum plate with small diamonds embedded on them. And I like these a lot. They work obviously faster, but they are extremely useful for both getting rid of the spiked sides, you can go on the side, or just flattening out the whetstone. And similarly, obviously, it can be used to generate slurry. The problem with these plates realistically is cost. The ones without the handles are probably in the $60 to $80 range. You can find cheaper ones out there, but not too much cheaper than that. So if your budget is limited, something like this that's included, or maybe like $5 is going to be a lot easier to come across than the diamond plate. But if you end up finding you really like using your whetstones and you use your knives a lot and you're doing this more often, the diamond plate can be a really big improvement to the process. So keep that in mind, it's an option. Moving forward, we probably need to talk about also two different types of stones. This is information that is equally compatible with synthetic and natural stones, which is a stone that is either a soak and go stone is frequently the phrase, or a soaking required stone, a soaking stone. In this case, we'll just demonstrate by looking at these two. Yes, we have a synthetic and a natural, but there are plenty of synthetics that are soak and goes. There are plenty of naturals which are soaking stones that need water for a bit of time. So if we'll take a look at our king first. These are notorious soaking stones. We can see it's a little wet here from a previous use, but usually it would look like this when it's fully dry. And even then, I've not soaked this for long enough for it to be fully hydrated. So if I spray on our water, you can see very quickly we lose it, that the stone sucks it up. When you're using this, they recommend you put it in a bowl of water or something for 5 minutes before you use it. After that 5 minutes, it would become fully hydrated and it would act a lot more like this stone. Which this stone is still definitely sucking up water, and if we leave it for a little bit, you'll see it starts pulling away from the sides, or hopefully you can see it starts pulling away from the sides because it is pulling in that water. But unlike this stone, where there's so little on top that if we worked our knife, the water would completely go away, this stone will have enough water left on it that as we begin to use it, we have water left over and the slurry it stays hydrated. Now, this water is important to keep on the surface of the stone. You always want to keep the surface mud hydrated. A, it adds lubrication. B, it helps in moving the particles around, which cuts the blade. But the most important factor we're looking for is that if you rub your blade on the surface of the stone without water, it will significantly heat up the edge of your blade, and it will alter the heat treatment of the metal that your blade is comprised of. When you do that, it is likely to what's called lose the temper, and you will lose the ability for the blade to keep a very nice sharp edge for as long as the metal would naturally be able to with its factory heat treatment. So you want to keep this hydrated so that you don't overgenerate that heat and ruin your blade's edge. So when you're looking at your whetstones, especially when you're starting out as a beginner, you need to determine if the stone you're looking at is a splash and go stone or a soaking stone. They both can work equally well, but of course this has a little bit more time requirement. You can't just pull it out of a drawer and work with it. You got to put it in water. Most natural stones will not be as thirsty as this one. Most natural stones, you could use this sprayer and spray a couple rounds and you'll see that it eventually hydrates the top level surface. These king stones are notorious, these 1000 grit king stones are notorious soaking stones. They're very, very thirsty and you really got to give them that full time, but when you do, they perform pretty great for the money. So with that said, we're going to go ahead and take a look at actually using the stone, putting a little bit of time on the blade, with the blade on the surface. I'm not going to cover any form of polishing the blade. It's a lot more involved of a topic, and the point of this is to try to keep it fairly entry level for individuals who are interested in knife sharpening for maybe the first time or are having problems getting a good technique down, what they can go ahead and do to get on the right path and hopefully use a technique that will lead to some level of success. So okay, let's go ahead and move our synthetic out of the way. And this stone would pull up slurry on its own, which means if we run the blade over it in a sharpening capacity, we would not need to use a Nagura. But regardless of the stone that you have, you always can use a Nagura to just pull up a little bit of mud. And that can help you speed up the process. Additionally, you'll see I do have a sprayer. You know, it's a very useful part of the process to just rehydrate the stone. You don't need it though. You could use a bowl of water in your hand or a faucet, depending on your setup. Again, if you already have a sprayer at home full of just water, you can use it. Or if you like this after trying it and you find it useful to use your Whetstones, then you can always buy one for cheap. One thing actually I'm going to bring the synthetic back to talk about, because I almost missed it, is grit ranges. There is a standard Japanese developed grit range for Whetstones, and given that a lot of the original synthetic Whetstones were developed in Japan, the market has kind of rallied behind their grit format. So this King Whetstone is a 1,000, 6,000. Most Whetstones out there would follow the same grit pattern as the King. However, if you go to the hardware store, for instance, and you buy sandpaper, that sandpaper is not going to use the Japanese grading method. It's going to use probably the American one. And there's a European one, and there's other regions that have their own grading methods. And for instance, American 3M 1000 grit sandpaper is probably far more similar to this 6,000 grit side than this 1,000 grit side. So if you're going to use grits that are not Whetstone oriented in conjunction with Whetstones, or you have experience with American sandpaper and you're looking at the stone and saying like, okay, I know this 1,000 grit will act like my 1,000 grit sandpaper, you have to break yourself a little bit of that. On the naturalwhetstones.com website and some other websites, there are charts you can find that will compare those different standards to one another. So if you're very familiar with grit ratings in America or Europe or something, you can see what the comparable grit ratings are for Whetstones that use this Japanese rating, which again are almost all of them. So we'll go ahead and take a look. In this case, getting back on with things, we will go ahead and use a Nagura just to demonstrate what it looks like. And you're not using a whole lot of pressure here. You don't want to dig into your stone. You don't want to make your own low spots. You just want to kind of keep it nice and light on the surface. And over time, you will see that the mud is partially generated on its own. And again, the mud can be called mud or slurry, is their synonyms. You will hear people refer to something called a swarf. Swarf is when your slurry mixes with the bits of metal that are coming off your blade as you apply abrasive to it, and it'll turn a dark color. Actually, translated from Japanese, it's called juice, so they'll call it stone juice. But anyway, you can see we have our slurry here. It just looks like suspended stone particles. It's real fine to the touch, and the synthetic stones would look exactly the same, probably just would have generated it a little faster. So now we're going to take a look at using our blade on the stone. Now, when I show how to do certain things, I'm going to be probably using my stone in this direction so that the camera picks it up in a viewable format. However, before we get into it, understand that really you want to try to use as much of the surface of your stone as you can to avoid those low spots. So traditionally when I'm sharpening, I'm going to be going, this way, up and down the stone and trying to use it as much as I reasonably can. However, that won't make it very easy to see what I'm talking about on the camera. So I am going to be using my stone today more like this. Just understand that when you use yours, don't totally mimic that process. Take it just as a need to present properly here. So the first thing that's usually talked about when you go to sharpen is angles, but we're actually first going to start with what you're attempting to accomplish. So obviously, your blade edge is coming up to a point. We call that point the apex, where the metal actually forms the individual edge. And when we're sharpening, unless if we're just touching it up a little bit, our goal is to form a new apex on the blade. And the way that we're going to do that is through our abrasive. We're going to migrate the metal to the edge of the blade on one side, and eventually it will make our current edge, our current apex, so thin that it becomes typically what we refer to as a burr or a wire edge. And that metal will be so thin and so lacking in structure that it will actually start kind of curling over the other way. And that's what we call having formed a burr. So when we're doing it, the apex will go from feeling equal on both sides, probably equally like grabby on both sides, to very grabby on one side and maybe almost smooth on the other, because you've actually rolled that burr to the opposite side. So when you're working your whetstone, your goal is to form that burr all to one side, and obviously if we're working it this way, the burr will roll like that. If we're working it right this way, the burr will roll like that. So you start on one side and you form that burr, and then your goal is to switch to the other side of the knife and actually remove that piece of metal. If you look at it with a jeweler's loupe, which you might already have for other purposes, you can actually see that, that little tiny wire piece of metal will actually kind of get peeled off as you work the other side of the metal. Depending on the knife that you have, harder steel knives will be able to remove that wire easier on the stone. Cheaper knives like just soft Chinese stainless steel, not that all stainless steel is soft, but your typical commercial consumer grade knife from like a big box store will be very soft steel, so it doesn't chip on the random person in a kitchen who might be mistreating it. These will have a far harder time getting the burr off because the metal is softer, so it's more likely to wiggle back and forth. You will eventually get it off, you just got to keep working on the stone. So if you find that your burr is being wiggly, maybe use a little bit more pressure, but just time will probably be the factor there. You can also try maybe a coarser grit stone if you have variety, but given we're talking about beginner stones, you're probably starting on a 1000 stone, and you'll just need to spend a little bit more time, or again, apply a little bit more pressure to it. So okay, now that we've covered that, we are next going to cover finding the angle to sharpen at. Now, if you do research on forums or other information repositories, you're going to find that the angle you sharpen your edge at can be largely determined by the steel or the metal that comprises your blade. That the heat treatment and quality of steel can take a more acute angle. So a really high quality knife might be able to take an angle down to 14, 15 degrees. A lower quality soft stainless steel knife might want an angle in the 20 degree range. 20 plus or something even. Now, as a beginner, it's going to be really hard to say, oh, this is a 15, that's a 20, that's a 30 or something like that. You're not going to have that experience, and I'm not even sure if my measurements there were correct. So the easiest method, in my opinion, for people who are just starting out is to go half and then half again. So we start with the blade pretty much straight up. We're going to half it between the stone and that, and then we're going to half that again. You'll end up with something like this. It's not going to be perfect, half, half, half. You're not going to get an exact angle every time, but what it will do is ensure that you get an angle right around probably 20 to 22 degrees. And that angle is within a margin of error. If you wiggle the blade a little bit, you're less likely to scratch your surface here on your blade. Over time, learning, you probably still will, but you're less likely to if you're not going too low. Additionally, if you're using a stainless steel cheap soft knife, which I generally recommend you do as you're learning, you're in a range of angle that the blade can take. Versus, again, if you're going too low, you might find that you forever have problems because the blade won't take the edge. So starting at that 20 to 22 degree angle may not be where you want to be once you're very experienced, but when you're just starting out, right, you're looking for a successful sharpening job. You're not looking for the best sharpening job. So we're learning and we're getting the movements down. I suggest that half half, half. Well, half, half. 2 halves, right? To about that 22 degrees. Some people will say 3 pennies in height. Some people will say a matchbook under your blade. I've never personally found those to be very helpful. So to me, if I feel like I lost the angle when I was starting, I would just start over again. And then over time, as you gain consistency and muscle memory, you can then start to experiment with going a little bit lower and seeing what your knives can do. But in the beginning, right, I would just consider resetting when you're unsure if you kept your angle, and then doing the half and half situation. The other item to consider as you're starting out is whether you're going to keep the same hand on the handle for both sides of the knife. Obviously, you're trying to form that burr through metal migration with the abrasion, and obviously taking metal off too. You're trying to form that burr, and some people will sharpen, for instance, like this, and then they'll flip over and sharpen like this. And they don't, and you know, they have the same hand doing the same job. Alternatively, and my preferred method is to sharpen like this, and then when I want to knock the burr off, I would switch hands and then do the same process. The reason for this is that until you're more experienced, doing edge leading instead of edge trailing strokes is it's harder to keep the angle. You can't form that tension that you can with this between your hands. This, you got more wobble. But more than anything, you might cut your fingers more readily. Even doing edge trailing, you might nick your finger a little bit, but this could really slice you. And if your whetstone is soft, which it probably is if it's a coarser starting whetstone, you're more likely to dig into your actual whetstone with the blade if your angle is incorrect. So it takes maybe a little bit more experience to do this, and I generally suggest people stick with the edge trailing as they're learning. So we will shoot for around that 20 to 22 degree angle, and we're going to do edge trailing. So we're gonna take our blade, put it on the stone, half it again, and we're gonna take our 2 index and middle finger, and we're gonna put it at the edge of the blade. Now, your blade obviously has a geometry to it, where you're not going to be able to put the entire knife edge on the blade at once. So you are going to have to adjust this handle hand a little bit as you work down the blade. You can see me rocking a little bit to make sure that you're touching the edge, right? So we want to touch this area as we move forward and back. We want to see that it's getting contact. And then as we move, you are going to have to adjust your knife a little bit so that the area your middle finger and your index finger are on is most certainly making contact. So by the time you're down here, your hand has bottomed out the knife for sure. You're not putting pressure with this hand. You're just controlling that angle. All the pressure is coming from these 2 fingers on the knife edge. Now, when we're starting, you want to go basically as slow as you can so you can control the blades, something like just to really concentrate on that angle could be the speed you want to learn at. Additionally, if you find you can do it, you want to put pressure moving forward, no real pressure moving back. Pressure moving forward, no pressure moving back. Because that'll help you form that burr faster. If you find that doing that is like wobbling your blade too much, which means you're not being consistent enough, but it's a common beginner problem, you can just put equal pressure going back and forth. You will still form your burr, and you might find it to be more consistent. However, you do want to end up trying to aspire to relieve the pressure and only do it moving forward. The second thing is, we do have this hand keeping a consistent angle. You want to use a pinch grip when you're doing it so you have control of the spine. And similarly, you probably should explore using a pinch grip whenever you're using your knife rather than this. But it will be essential to have complete control of the spine for a consistent angle. And we did say you're not putting pressure with this hand, but you are moving this hand. Sometimes you'll hear people say this hand does the movement and the other one just keeps the angle, but if you do that, you're going to find the blade wants to do this. like that. You're not going to actually get a consistent movement. So when we're moving our hands, we actually want them to feel like they're connected by a stick or something, right? We want to have them move at the same time, back and forth. So you are getting movement out of this hand, you are keeping angle with this hand. You're getting movement out of this hand and you're applying pressure. So that's where those differences come in. How much pressure do you apply with your non-handle hand? Experiment some. There is no one definitive rule, but the common starting place you hear is a little bit more pressure than taking a pulse. But if you are in the early stages of your knife and you have a lot of metal you want to remove, you might apply more pressure than that. If you are at the very end stages on a 6,000 grit stone, or you're just barely touching up the edge so it's as keen as possible, you might put a lot less pressure, right? Just enough so that you know the area of the blade is making contact. So as we're going, again, we want to keep slow. If we can do the on-off pressure, great. If you ever feel like you lose your angle or you slip, that's fine. Just reset it a little bit. And, you know, after a few times of doing this, finding the angle, resetting will become easier. Now you're seeing that my hand's actually moving, and that does come with some level of experience that I'm going forward, and on the way back, I can actually shift my hand down some. Usually you're going to want to spend a little bit of time in one section of the knife, and then as you feel like, okay, I probably spent enough time here, you would switch the geometry a little bit, move the finger down, and go again. With some experience, you can do that as you saw, where I just might work the whole edge of the knife in motion. But as a beginner, there's no reason for you to do that. You can work one edge of the knife, and then when you say to yourself, okay, I would like to move on, you can stop, you can move your finger down, and you can go back. Your whole knife can be finished this way. You can even go slower if you want. There's no reason that you have to go super fast and look cool while you're doing it. You're just trying to get usable edge and make sure that you get the entirety of your knife. So you're going to do that all the way down. Which, for the sake of your sanity, I might not actually do it for the whole blade edge. Also, this angle is hard. You know, it's not, I would normally work the stone like this. So you're going to go down all the way to the bottom and try to keep that angle consistent. Try to keep your motion where your hands are together, and you're going to feel if you have formed that burr. And again, it should feel smooth on one side, a little bit grabby on the other. You're just doing it real light. You're not trying to cut yourself. Keep the knife still while you do it. That was not enough to form the burr, but a few more passes like that, where I'm actually doing the full length of the knife, we probably would have formed a burr. And then if you are going to adopt my suggestion, you would switch your hand, and we still have our pinch grip, and you're going to adopt the exact same philosophy. You're going to, if you needed to start over, you're going to go half, half, knife on, start your tip, go slow, and then you're going to follow the geometry while you use your, in this case, right hand to apply pressure, left hand to keep your angle. And we're moving our hands together as though they are one big shelf. And that will lead us to knocking that burr off. And the only way you're going to know is if you keep feeling. You're going to have to feel the blade and see if it's rolled. You want to keep working on one side till it's rolled, and then you want to work the other side until hopefully you've knocked it off. With a 1,000 grit stone, that should be enough to knock it off. If you find that the burr is flipping back and forth, try to apply a little bit more pressure than you have been using. If you're trying to knock a burr off on a 6,000 grit stone or an overly soft or overly fine natural stone, you may never really get it to go away. So you want to knock that burr off at the lower grits and then move into your finer grit stones when it comes time to polish the new apex you've made, not use the fine grit stone to make your new apex. So when it comes to this process, hopefully we've worked our knife edge enough on the stone to get our burr and then switch hands and knock the burr off. So if we were on a synthetic, that would be done on our 1,000. On a natural stone, it would be done on what's called probably like a nakatoishi or an aratoishi, but certain natural stones can do it all at once. However, in this case, you're probably just starting out, so you've probably done it on your 1000 coarser side. In this case, you'd flip over to your finer side to refine your edge. In the case of a natural stone where we can do everything, and I don't want to actually discourage you from getting a natural stone for your first stone, it just takes a lot of learning and to know what you're doing, but this stone is actually a great example of a stone that's probably coarse enough to be an all-arounder, so long as you aren't trying to remove a chip from your blade. But what you will do in either case is you might still want to form a slurry as a middle step, run over your 6K stone like we just did, but at the end of that step, if you wanted a second middle step, at the end of the process, you're going to want to take the slurry off and just use water on the top of your stone with no slurry. It will slow the cutting down, because that slurry does aid in abrasion, but we want it to be slower, we want it to be as fine as possible, and we're going to use the exact same process we've been using, but with much lighter pressure. Like rather than getting a pulse, you're just touching the skin. And that's what we're going to do here. You might even be able to hear from the feedback that it sounds a little different, maybe a little bit more mellow, and this will help us with the tools that we do have, with the stone you have in your possession, polish the edge as much as possible and align the teeth of the blade at the apex as much as possible to get the finest edge you can get. There are a couple different ways that you can do that beyond the stone if you want. You might have seen something like this in the past called honing steel, honing rod. If it's made of steel, I would recommend you throw it in the garbage. If it's made of ceramic, it could work for you, but at the end of the day, I like strops the best, but a honing rod made of ceramic can still get the job done. I don't really think if you don't have a ceramic honing rod or a strop, you don't need either of those things as a beginner to get a really usable edge. You should just need one or two different stones. Again, one stone if you find one of the natural stones that can kind of do both, an earlier grit and a later grit for you, or two different synthetic stones. If you really wanted to, you could go this combo route, but again, I think you have better options out there. And hopefully following this, again, going slow, keeping the angle, forming the burr is really what you're trying to hope for. Some of the most common mistakes, which we've already covered some, is, as you're moving, you might find you go too low, scratch the blade edge. It's not the end of the world. You can fix that with sandpaper or stone polishing if you want to get into polishing your blade. Otherwise, you can just accept it too. It's not going to hurt the cutting performance of the knife. The other two common ways that you might find you mess up the process as a beginner is by digging in the heel of the blade. If you're accidentally putting pressure with your right hand, which again shouldn't be pressing down with it, you might dig in with the back point of your blade and leave a streak within your whetstone. The same can be true for the knife's tip as well. It's a little bit less common on the tip, but when your blade gets taller, especially if you're using like a Chinese cleaver that has a lot of weight behind it, you may fall prone to trying to get the tip sharpened, putting pressure on it, and the weight of the blade may naturally dig in to the whetstone. So in such cases, you want to take a little bit extra effort to make sure you're really not digging into the whetstone, and that can be helped a little bit. You notice that I tend to sharpen with the blade at an angle. That's what's always felt the most comfortable to me, and I have, with experience, not been digging into my whetstones in the front and their back. But with really large Chinese cleavers, I still find I tend to do more the blade being horizontal to the whetstone itself, because it's less likely that I accidentally dig into the surface with the tip. So if you're finding that's happening to you, you can get a Nagura or some sandpaper or something and just even out the scratch so that you don't have any raised areas from it. And then you can try again. If you're worried about it in general, you might want to start with this more horizontal pattern, but personally I find I have to bend my wrist in a certain way that is fairly uncomfortable. I like this little bit more in between angle. However, that is kind of a key point of sharpening on whetstones in general, is learning what works for you, finding your own style, trying different things. In the beginning, you want to try that half angle, get consistency, go slow, so you can feel what it's like to get the job done. And then afterwards, you can find the angle you like, the pressure you like, the stone that you like, the different orientation, whether switching hands is for you. All of that is personal preference. Even if you look at master sharpener videos, they all still have their own quirks and do it differently. And you will too once you gain some experience. So I hope that for those of you who are just starting out, this has helped get a little bit of a handle of what you should be looking for, the different, characteristics, I guess, of stones. That we don't have the time, nor do I have the willpower to cover all of the different synthetic stones you could buy. But there are plenty of other channels and resources out there if you don't want to get just a cheap king as a starter. And this way, if you've been struggling to get an edge or you're starting, hopefully you will find that you actually get the end product you want, a very sharp knife out of your whetstone, which will be your first step towards hopefully a long journey exploring them and seeing all the things that they can do. So anyway, thanks. Until next time.